There are no serious general problems with the motors. Everything is arranged simply and extremely practical, so I'll only remind you about ECU blocks, soldering violations, failure of some microcircuits, and corrosion of the contact group are possible here. So for gasoline cars, be sure to check its condition and take care of it after purchase. This unit is expensive. Well, not too durable rubber elements and very cheap performance should not scare you here. The whole car is made like that. Basically, the car in Russia is presented with a petrol 8-valve 1.4-liter engine of the Fire series. This is a very successful engine with a good overall resource, quite unpretentious, and its only drawback can be called modest returns. It may throw up some surprises during operation, but they are few in number. For example, the engine may suffer from increased oil consumption and the associated relatively small resource of catalysts with frequent movement along the highway. Moreover, this happens with any oil, including Siomia, which is adored by Fiat growers. This is not surprising, given the 4,000 revolutions when driving at speeds over 100 km/h and the rather simple design of the VCG. The oil level needs to be monitored, and the catalyst. Just check it more often. Capricious throttle and some little things that sometimes need to be replaced are also a consequence of the overall budget. And the timing belt is better to change every 60,000 maximum. And it's not worth bringing the matter to a cliff. Formally, the valves do not bend, but sometimes incidents happen. In general, if you do not neglect maintenance, then the motor passes its more than 300,000 mileage perfectly. And anyone can cope with such a motor. It is very simple. The 1.2-liter engine essentially differs little from the 1.4-liter engine, but it is loaded more heavily and its age is more solid. He has very little traction. There are more problems with the oil burner on the highway. The old components of the ignition system often fail, but in general this is also a successful motor. But the 1.6-liter engine is a completely different calico. It comes mainly in a version for running on gas, with a factory-installed gas system. This motor is a close relative of the Ziguli one. It has a 16-valve cylinder head and a timing belt drive, but the commonality in the design of the block is still visible. We have little experience in operating such motors and are usually based on cars brought with huge mileage. Well, the Italians consider the engine to be quite reliable, but uneconomical. Of the major shortcomings, only the need to change the timing belt very often is called better once every 40,000. I have already praised the 1.9 JTD 8-valve diesel engines. I talked about them in reviews of Saab 9-3 and Opel Vectra. These are quite powerful units for Doblo. The top one produces 120 horsepower and provides good dynamics even when the car is loaded. It's a pity, they are expensive and rare. And the naturally aspirated version is generally a huge rarity. The disadvantages include the need for frequent monitoring of the state of the timing, and in case of problems with the high-pressure fuel pump, the belt resource drops dramatically. It is better not to delay the replacement in any case. The motor is quite dependent on the operation of the DMRV, which means that it requires the replacement of filters often and only with very high-quality ones. The fuel equipment works stably on the whole and has only a couple of problems. The high-pressure fuel pump tends to underestimate the operating pressure, which is treated by replacing the valve in it, and on long runs, thousands over 300, the nozzles can increase the flow and do it unevenly. This causes an increase in vibration levels and fuel consumption. It is much easier to buy a car with a 1.3 JTD engine, and at first glance the engine is not bad. However, the 1.3 multi-jet is surprisingly complex for its power and volume. It is a 16-valve timing chain with serious variable geometry turbines and a particulate filter. And, interestingly, with a minimum of plastic in the design. The disadvantages usually include a tendency to oil appetite, an unsuccessfully implemented filter burning procedure, souring of nozzles in the seats, and a rather troublesome timing mechanism with a not very successful tensioner and a completely unpredictable chain resource. The chain resource can be 80,000 or maybe 300. This is a real lottery. Of course, there are reasons for such behavior. For example, a motor has a very low oil bath volume and is very sensitive to the condition of the oil. And for a diesel engine, this means that it is sensitive to operating modes. And if you just change the oil according to the regulations, do not pay attention to its contamination and buy cheap oil filters, then the engine will definitely respond to this not only with an increase in oil appetite, but also with a dead timing. The advantages of this diesel engine, of course, are efficiency and fairly high power. Of course, 75 and even 84 horsepower look unconvincing, but in reality it is reduced in power mainly due to the weak manual transmission. By replacing the manual gearbox with the more reliable S.510, you can easily boost the engine to 110 to 130 horsepower, which is quite realistic for it. He tolerates work with such a degree of forcing very well. And when EGR is turned off and or only very high quality fuel is used, it pleases with the life of the piston group. If you don't miss the oil level, then even with mileage of 300,000, the engines do not have ring wear or stuck rings, and they delight in starting qualities and traction. Have you already noticed that I linked fuel quality and EGR? This motor is very sensitive to the quality of diesel fuel, and I can't even attribute this to the minuses of the motor. Moreover, the fuel equipment is quite strong and endures, in general, everything. The question is precisely the amount of soot and the problems associated with it. Among the interesting features, it should be noted that the engine is assembled in Poland and is also installed en masse on Opel cars. These engines themselves are inexpensive. The price does not rise above €700 for the smallest living example, and we have a lot of Opels, and there are enough specialists in them. The Doblo's brakes are simple and fairly reliable. Front brakes disc with a disc diameter of 257 or 284 millimeters, rear drum. And, nicely, all European versions have ABS. Unfortunately, we also got versions for third world countries and cars assembled in Poland for internal use, and ABS may be absent on such machines. But on the machines of our assembly and directly imported from Turkey, there is always ABS. For commercial vehicles, this is a fundamental point. Until the middle of the 2000s, the anti-lock system was optional on it, and many vans were ordered without ABS. In a long winter and a very wide range of rear axle load changes, driving a car without ABS is extremely unpleasant and dangerous. There are no problems with this. Complaints about the Doblo brake system are mostly limited to complaints about the effectiveness of the brakes for a loaded car, the resource of the GTZ, and rather capricious calipers. There are two types of calipers on Doblo, and both require regular monitoring of the condition of the anthers and fairly frequent replacement of both the fingers and their seals. Many Doblo owners manage to repair the brakes during the warranty period. The brake master cylinder is a bit capricious and fails if the brake fluid is not changed at least once every 3 to 5 years. If you don't change the fluid, you will have to change it along with the fluid and the GTZ. There is no need to be afraid of Doblo brake repairs. Everything here is very inexpensive and simple. All components cost pennies, and both anthers and fingers are on sale. True, you will have to look for them in the parts catalogs of specialized suppliers. The pads will cost no more than on a Ziguli, and the discs cost pennies. The rear brake drums are also cheap, even in the original version. Their service life depends on the load, but for passenger cars it is completely passenger, but for those who like to carry heavy loads, and even in hilly areas, the pads can burn out faster. Corrosion of brake system pipes is rare. They are laid out successfully, and if the body itself is not rotten, then everything is usually fine with them. But the front brake hoses should be inspected carefully. They can swell near the rolling points. It is believed that such a defect occurs due to the short length of the hose. It pulls at the maximum rebound stroke of the suspension. The Doblo handbrake is capricious, and its design will make everyone who has ever adjusted this system on a VAZ cry. Craftsmen even put cables from Ziguli and Niva. And although the design is very simple, openly located cable entries into the shirt are not for our climate. They must be regularly shed with ATP, otherwise the cable will freeze slightly in winter. Suspension from Doblo without frills, McPherson strut in front and a continuous beam on the springs in the rear. Unlike the French, they did not apply strange design solutions here, and everything turned out perfectly. The front suspension is structurally the same as in earlier cars and the same albia, but the levers and supports are reinforced. The ball joint is replaceable, as is the front silent block of the lever. But the rear one does not change regularly, but non-original silent blocks with a bracket are on sale. If the central axis of the lever is not worn, there will be no problems with replacement. The supports are strong and sag only with regular overload, but the springs are rather weak. Ground clearance due to them is gradually reduced even on machines that rarely drive with a load. Rubber buffer and spring spacer usually need to be changed by 10 years of operation, or even earlier. In general, the front suspension on passenger cars and in urban operation quite predictably lasts more than 80,000 kilometers before major repairs. It is repaired inexpensively, but one must be able to look for spare parts and not rush to buy the first parts that come across. The rear spring suspension is very unusual for most car owners from the 20th century. But on commercial vehicles, small leaf springs are still in use. They are as simple as possible. They replace both the spring and the guide vane, and the difficult dilemma handling or comfort does not arise in the case of this truck. By and large, he is neither one nor the other especially, and is not supposed to. In the case of Doblo, they were too shy to make the suspension really oak, so on old cars it is often reinforced with springs. The suspension is also being finalized by those who like to load 1.5 tons into the heel. For all its simplicity, the spring suspension is not eternal. Over time, the spring sags, the bushings of the central jet thrust, the bushings of the anti-roll bar and the spring pins wear out. In addition, there are shock absorbers, which also wear out over time. Therefore, the rear suspension requires maintenance, of course, but the total resource of its main elements is very high. Well, when buying a car, it is important to check the condition of the beam, which is sometimes damaged, and wheel bearings. Doblo steering is with conventional power steering. There is little trouble with it. During normal operation, the rail serves for a long time, small backlashes are usually removed by tightening, and it has no particular problems with tightness and corrosion. Spool seals leak only at runs over 200,000 kilometers. Knocks and other problems can be expected at a run over 300,000. The resource of a not quite typical power steering pump is not very high, but the price of relatively decent options starts from 5,000. The pump extremely dislikes overloading the machine and rare fluid changes, but there is always a way out. Used pumps from old cars are suitable for Doblo, but they cost a penny. The main problem of Doblo from the point of view of Muscovites is the lack of automatic transmission. Otherwise, no weaknesses were noticed, apart from the manual gearbox. There are CV joints on sale, although the internal tripod is sold only separately, and the hinge glass exists only as a drive element. Well, now let's move on to the main headache, the gearboxes. There are two options for mechanical gearboxes. With gasoline engines they installed the C.514 box, which relied on both a naturally aspirated diesel on cars before restyling, and a 1.3-liter diesel engine, but cars with 1.9-liter turbo diesels were equipped with a much more powerful boxed C.510. All Doblo boxes are 5-speed, but sometimes you can find a car with a 6-speed. This is easily explained. Instead of a dead native box, they could put a box of the same series, but a 6-speed one from another car. The flywheel with all motors is single mass, and the clutch is quite successful. The S.514 series manual transmission is a real punishment for the car owner. This box has extremely poor shaft bearings, and even the gearbox version with index 514 are for 1.6-liter engines has insufficient bearing capacity. Under increased loads they regularly fail. Even just frequent trips along the highway at speeds over 110 km per hour can cause their rapid destruction, and there's no talk of driving them. If the car is loaded, it's better to go straight to repairs. Okay, I'm kidding, not right away, but seriously speaking, such boxes often do not survive the first suspension repair, requiring a rebuild after 50,000 mileage. Dieseling and knocking are characteristic signs of bearing failure, and it is better not to delay repairs. Spare parts are not cheap, and besides, you can finish off the rather weak tapered differential bearings. Such trifles as oil leaks and wear of the synchronizers of the second and third gears are already trifles. You still have to sort through the gearbox. A diesel car with a C.510 gearbox will be much more reliable. And if the factory bearings were once changed to normal ones, with a metal cage and roller ones at the front end of the shaft, then the box becomes eternal. Unfortunately, the factory version does not differ in extreme reliability and often also starts to buzz and knock. It runs up to 100,000 kilometers. And it's good that later cars had a box that was modified at the factory. The external condition of the Doblo body is more dependent on loads and maintenance than on the age of the car. Even the earliest copies still come across in a very good external condition, while cars produced in 2007 to 2010, after intensive use, can be with holes in the thresholds and with a bunch of small foci of corrosion. The main weak points of the model are the body sills and the lower parts of the door panels. A rather delicate paint job and a small layer of anti-gravel on the lower part of the body do little to prevent chipping, while the high load on the sills and clogged drains of all doors create a favorable environment for the development of corrosion. If the owners neglected minor paintwork defects, did not monitor the serviceability of the drainage and simply overloaded the car, then all this will be clearly visible from the outside. Fortunately, the metal here is well galvanized and gives time to eliminate defects. He even takes lightly to repairs that are not of very high quality. The bulk of the cars do not have any serious damage to the body, and frankly rotten specimens are very rare. But vigilance, of course, is worth showing, especially when examining the thresholds. It is quite expensive to digest them, and outbid bypass technologies are used to the full. There is also putty in places of failures in the lower part, and endings molded from epoxy at the arches. In general, be careful with thresholds when inspecting. Hiding door defects is difficult. It is more expensive to hide the imperfections of the rolling at the bottom of the door than to replace its entire panel, so they usually don't bother with cosmetics. At best, they will slightly cover up the rust with anti-gravel. Age and stress leave their marks on other parts of the body. Small chips and even small pockets of corrosion can often be found on the windshield frame, around the door handles, on the arches, and, of course, on the front of the hood, especially if the car is highway. For cars from rainy regions, pay attention to the lower part of the front fender. There is a not very successful mud pocket, and if the wing was not cleaned behind the lockers, then this will be visible from the condition of the edges of the arch and the edge of the wing itself. You can view this place with the door open. Do not be too lazy to bend the window seals of the sliding side and rear doors, under which older cars often have unpleasant corrosion. And special attention should be paid to the rail fastening area of sliding doors, which accumulate dirt and around which many small defects often appear. Inspect the installation locations of the doorstops. Here the metal of the door often breaks at the attachment point. I must say that the Fiat Doblo is preserved just fine for commercial vehicles. But the most lively specimens are always passenger versions that never went on the line and were serviced directly by the owners. And pay attention to the runs. You should not expect a miracle from cars with a mileage of 500,000 kilometers. The body structure here is extremely simple, and therefore it is well preserved and just as easily repaired. From below, first of all, it is worth inspecting the thresholds and jacks. The sill may have characteristic fatigue cracks in the middle and rear, as well as broken welding points with reinforcement. Internal corrosion of the outer sill panel manifests itself mainly in the form of perforation, which goes almost along the junction with the amplifier from below. Dirt accumulates there, and if the thresholds are not anti-corrosive, then a characteristic type of damage can be found even on cars of the last years of production. Another source of potential threshold problems is the side door rail niche. Before inspection, it is very desirable to wash it with Karcher. Dirt accumulates there, and holes under it are easily formed. Be careful when inspecting power elements. traces of cracks at the junction of the engine shield and floor spars, and corrosion damage to the seams of the load-bearing structure near the attachment points of the ladders of the rear suspension springs are characteristic signs of severe overload. Sometimes a ton or more was loaded into the machine, although the body was not designed for such a load. And he corny cracked from such an overload, after which corrosion is able to finish off the power structure completely. By the way, carefully inspect the rear door opening and its seams. Here, too, traces of overloads during operation are sometimes visible. And on the floors of the body there may be traces of rough loading from the loader. The body floors in the rear are surprisingly well preserved. But the fuel tank located here is a headache for all owners of old cars. It is steel and rots both from the side, at the entry points of the fuel filler pipe, and from above, in the recesses around the fuel pump niche. The original tank is expensive, so traces of epoxy are a clear reason to think about the quality of car maintenance and the amount of the discount if you buy it. Inspection of the body from the inside should start with the glasses of the front suspension. If the machine has not been beaten and has not been operated with an overload on primers, then the seams must be in perfect condition, and the holes for the rack mounting bolts must not have any signs of corrosion. Dirt collects very well in the niche between the fender and the body pillar, but the protection of the seams here is done with high quality. Water and dirt from the cup drain into a pocket between the fender and the body pillar, but from above the state of the cavity is clearly visible in the mirror, although it is better to inspect it by removing the fender liner. The procedure for cleaning this cavity should be carried out regularly, and if the sealant is damaged, it is worth cleaning everything with sandblasting, repriming, and sealing. On the inside of the arch, light surface corrosion, unfortunately, occurs constantly. But thanks to galvanizing, there is no big problem with this. The front panel of the radiators rusts quite intensively. It is clear that this is not terrible, but there is a reason to reduce the price. In addition, if a car from recent years of production has a similar defect, it is worth carefully studying its history. The hood panel may rust at the seams from the inside. Here pay attention to the seams at the front and on the side near the hinges. In the central part of the niche above the engine, dirt does not accumulate very intensively, but sometimes you still come across cars with whole beds under the plastic of this niche. The Doblo stove is prone to leaks, so checking the floors is a must. The smell of antifreeze and squelching rugs are quite common. Well, according to the state of the zone near the driver's seat box, one can draw conclusions about the condition of the body floors as a whole. And do not be too lazy to remove the door seal at least at the bottom of the opening. There may be surprises. We must not forget that Doblo is essentially a very budget car, and you should not demand the build quality and durability of small elements, like a German premium one. However, the simplicity of the design makes life much easier, even despite the existence of noticeable disadvantages. For example, the rear swing door lock is just a very annoying element. Here the rod of the handle axis sours tightly, and the tongue may close in the wrong direction, and corrosion of the aluminum eventually finishes off its body. Sliding doors wear out the guide mechanism and the lower lock. The mechanism must be kept clean and lubricated regularly, and do this by washing off the old grease with sand. The plastic bushings of the lower lock are consumable. During intensive use they have to be changed every 40 to 50,000 kilometers. Of the little things, I also note the need to take care of the contacts of the central lock. The front door locks are a little more reliable, but here the limiter fails. By 200 to 250,000 mileage, the trapezoid of the wipers wears out, and with long downtime it turns sour. It's good that the repair kit from Kalina saves the situation here. Headlights are a separate headache. We have a rarity before restyling, but they don't even have used optics. And the owners, meanwhile, complain about the already falling apart plastic and the general wear and tear of such headlights. In cars after 2006, with high mileage, the headlights turn yellow, burn out, and are easily overwritten, but they can be bought new very inexpensively. The quality of Turkish plastic is a separate issue. In the summer, everything is in order with him, but in the winter he becomes very fragile, and this applies not only to bumpers, but also to moldings, all the plastic husks under the hood and under the bumper, door handles, and everything else. The availability of new parts is gradually deteriorating, and this must be remembered. Side mirror vibrations in diesel versions are common, and the general vibration load of cross-country cars is largely to blame. Door seals on 10-year-old cars are already squealing at speed, and the driver's door is often still sagging due to wear on the hinges. The glass guide in it also often wears out, which is why the glass begins to rattle, and the whistling sound at speed cannot be eliminated even by replacing the seal. On the passenger side, the seal dries out and even cracks, and sliding window seals are generally a consumable item, unless the windows are blocked. At one time, Doblo was highly praised for the quality of the cabin. The ergonomics here are really good, but even after Vesta or Logan 2, everything here will seem gray and boring. Except the fact that even the cheapest cars of those times have a much more interesting interior and better materials. However, there are no complaints about the durability of the Doblo interior. Here everything can be washed almost out of a hose, the lever buttons are very durable, and the steering wheels and seats are kept in decent shape up to quite adequate 200 and more thousand mileage. Almost all breakdowns occur due to rough handling of the machine and as a result of high mileage. So do not be surprised by broken drawer latches, sagging visors, trembling mirrors, torn door lock cables, torn gearshift lever covers. By and large, everything here is done very well, and in the event of a breakdown it is easy and cheap to change. The main complaint relates to the delicate radiator of the stove. It, like many other Fiats, clogs when the antifreeze is changed infrequently and does not heat the driver's side well. And if the antifreeze has not been changed at all, it may leak. The radiator connection is also not the best. Steel pipes in the engine compartment rust, rubber pipes crack and leak. In general, do not be surprised if the entire line from the engine compartment is replaced with a silicone pipe. This is not a collective farm, but a serious improvement in design. The fan motor is weak, but cleaning and lubrication significantly extends its life. The simplest electrician has one serious weak point and several frivolous ones that manifest themselves at high mileage. However, here again the simplicity and convenience of repairs come to the rescue. There are almost no elements that are difficult and expensive to break. The exception is the engine control unit. Failure of engine control units on all gasoline engines is the most unpleasant thing that can happen in an electrician. The problem is about the same as on Saab with Trionic 8 or Opel Vectra C/Astra H. The control unit is mounted on the engine and is exposed to temperatures and vibrations. As a result, soldering failures are possible, failure of several of the least resistant microcircuits and, in addition, corrosion of the contact group due to water getting into it. At Saab, antifreeze gets there, but these are parts. It is moved to a cooler place, an air duct is organized, and the contacts are protected from water. When purchasing, carefully diagnose the car, because often problems only appear after several hours of driving. See the list of erased errors. Multiple failures with lambdas and other sensors often indicate a breakdown of the unit at the initial stage. The rest of the electrics are made rather roughly, but firmly. Its main problems are the wear of generators and radiator fans for mileage of 150 to 200,000, not very tight connectors in the cabin and engine compartment. In general, all this is solved simply by the planned replacement of these elements and the maintenance of all contacts and connectors using special lubricants at least once every couple of years. All elements are located conveniently, with the maintenance of strong problems do not arise. Well, all wear and tear items that are difficult to restore are still on sale. So it's still possible to buy an ignition switch contact group or power window control units.